FBI continuously singles out particular types of groups, and that the FBI is particularly unable to distinguish between dissent and First Amendment protected speech and actual terrorism when certain points of view are involved, and that the FBI treats those points of view themselves as evidence of future terrorist activity.
I'm Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Chief Gibbons. You are the Policy Director of Defending Rights Dissent. You authored the report Still Spying on Dissent, the enduring problem of FBI First Amendment abuse, and you are the host of the Still Spying podcast. As a journalist and researcher focusing on the abuses of the US national security state at home and abroad, you have written for, among others, the Intercept, The Nation, Jacobin, and In These Times.
Yes.
Great to have you on.
Well, thank you for inviting me on.
Chip, what activities are protected by the First Amendment and do not justify investigation by the FBI?
Sure. So the First Amendment protects your right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It protects your right to hold political views and advocate for them broadly. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court, in an opinion called Brandenburg versus Ohio, even went so far as to say that you have a right to sort of advocate for sort of abstract violence or illegality, so long as it's not imminently likely to happen. You have the specific intent to make it happen. So if you make vague comments about, I believe in revolution or things like that, the Supreme Court has ruled that that is protected by the First Amendment. Unfortunately, what we see time and time again is law enforcement and intelligence agencies repeatedly in this country monitoring First Amendment protected speech, monitoring completely nonviolent activity. A lot of this at the federal level comes through the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a lot of people watching might think of the FBI as a police force, and they are in part a police force, but they're also an intelligence agency. And the distinction between, police and intelligence is, in theory, and we know from our friends who are police abolitionists, this isn't always the case, that police are supposed to be gathering evidence using law enforcement mechanisms that can be used as evidence of a crime in a trial. But intelligence is just about broadly gathering information. So throughout the history of the FBI, we've seen those divisions of it that are part of its intelligence apparatuses engaging in political surveillance. And we also see that on the local level with, historically, at the turn of the 20th century, many police departments developed quote-unquote red squads, which were intelligence units dedicated to going after labor activists, socialists, things like that.
Could you please briefly address the history of these transgressions?
Sure. So the FBI is formed during the administration of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt wants to create a federal law enforcement agency. His attorney general asks Congress to do just that, and Congress says no. So when they go on recess, when Congress goes on recess, the Theodore Roosevelt administration creates the Bureau of Investigation anyways, as it was then called. Jump forward about 9 years, and the Bureau of Investigation, it's still not called the FBI, creates what's called the Radical Division, which later changes its name to the General Intelligence Division. So it's an intelligence division that is aimed at policing the speech that it deems radical. This division is headed by a young man named J. Edgar Hoover. It's involved in the Palmer raids, where people are rounded up, many times illegally, many times detained illegally, and in some cases deported. And there's widespread controversy over this entity within the Justice Department. People view it as a political spying apparatus. So in 1924, the Attorney General limits the FBI to just law enforcement purposes and puts an end to their intelligence gathering in theory. And at the same time, J. Edgar Hoover, who headed the Intelligence Division, then goes on to head the Federal Bureau of Investigation itself. Fast forward again to the 30s, and the FBI formally has its intelligence authorities reinstated, and it starts to use these authorities to spy on what it deems subversive thought. And the FBI begins a process of creating a list of people who are to be detained in the event of a national emergency without trial. They call this the custodial detention list. Attorney General Francis Biddle says you have no authority to do this. So the FBI just changes the name of the list to become the Security Index. And at the height of the Security Index in 1955, there are 26,174 names on it. By 1960, the FBI will have opened up investigations on over 400,000 quote-unquote subversive individuals and groups. The most infamous thing that the FBI does, and some of people watching might know this, is what's called COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. And what this is that in 1956, the FBI feels like it's lacking legal remedies to go after the Communist Party and prosecute them, right? They're not breaking laws per se. So they start a program to disrupt and neutralize them. And from its outset, the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO, is explicitly about addressing how do you stop lawful speech the FBI does not like. And in the landmark Senate investigation into these programs in the 70s, the Church Committee, they say very clearly, this wasn't even a counterintelligence program. This was a covert operation designed to protect the political and social establishment. It starts off with the Communist Party. The FBI has a very broad definition of who they can target under this. They have what's called the Communist Infiltration or Common Fill program, where they target other groups they think communists could quote unquote infiltrate. This is how they come after the NAACP, Martin Luther King originally. It expands to other left-wing groups. At one point, there's a COINTELPRO operation against the Ku Klux Klan. And then finally, its most vicious form, they start a COINTELPRO program against quote unquote black hate groups. And this is originally not focused on the Panthers, but it becomes very fixated on the Black Panthers. And the results of it are quite violent. The FBI helps to orchestrate a police raid in Chicago of the Illinois state chapter of Black Panther Party. The raid kills 2 people, Fred Hampton, who was a very charismatic figure who was doing sort of multiracial organizing in the Chicago area, as well as Mark Clark. A grand jury finds the police fire between like 99 to 100 times. The Panthers fire 0 to 1 times. So the police go in guns blazing and kill people. And, after the Watergate incident, and after a group of anti-war activists break into an FBI office and sort of reveal the existence of COINTELPRO, there's a movement to sort of rein this in. And what we see is very shortly after that reining in, we see the FBI is investigating opponents of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. It's investigating supporters of Palestinian rights. And these trends continue throughout the 90s. And then, of course, with 9/11, the FBI has a lot of its intelligence powers dramatically expanded, again, under the name of fighting terrorism and national security. And that sort of brings us up to the present moment.
What do you make of rationalizations where FBI and its supporters use for these First Amendment violations?
Sure. I mean, the FBI tries to argue somehow that this speech is dangerous. In the Hoover era, they would treat it as like subversive speech. Obviously, that's completely unconstitutional, has been repudiated. What we see now is that the FBI continuously uses domestic terrorism as its rationale for going after domestic organizations. We know from the files they have about Occupy Wall Street, the FBI says, it's a nonviolent movement, but a lone offender could infiltrate it and commit a violent act. They say the same thing about School of the Americas Watch, peaceful intentions, but unknown third party could, come in and do violence, which is true of any group. So why do they keep singling out anti-war, environmental, peace activists, things like that? There's an incident in Houston where they conduct over a year-long investigation of a anti-Keystone pipeline group to assess them to see if they have extremists in it, which is, not an appropriate use of the FBI. And the most recent and most disturbing thing we've seen has been this Black identity extremism report, which makes the claim that because of African American anger at racism, which is fully justified, because of anger at police murdering unarmed Black people, that there could be lethal retaliatory violence against police. And what that's doing is that's taking squarely First Amendment protected speech and treating it as a precursor to crime. And the FBI has adopted these sort of preventative approaches or so-called radicalization theories that basically are thought policing and speech monitoring, because they sort of try to prevent extremist violence, quote unquote, before it happens. But the first step to that happening is you adopt radical points of view. So that's treating certain points of view as a precursor to criminal activity. And if you're looking to prevent it from happening, well, then of course you single out the speech.
In the report, Still Spying on Dissent, there is a statement about an alleged deeply seated political bias within the FBI, I'm quoting. What is the evidence and what specifically is the nature of this bias?
Sure. So the report deals with open source information about incidences of FBI political surveillance that we know about. There's a lot going on we don't know about. It's a secretive organization, but through revelations through journalists, through revelations through FOIA requests, we're able to piece together a picture of what FBI surveillance looks like over a decade. So what do we find? We find that every major social movement of that decade, the FBI spies on. Occupy Wall Street, anti-war groups, Black Lives Matter, Palestinian rights advocates, abolish ICE protesters, environmental groups repeatedly. And what we see again and again are these claims that we're not going after speech, we're going after domestic terrorism, and while these groups aren't engaged in terrorism, don't have violent intentions, something about these groups means that they could become a precursor to violence. Something about these points of view could lead to criminality. And, what types of groups do they single out? Economic justice groups, racial justice groups, anti-war groups, and environmental groups. Again and again, we see that happening over the last decade. And if you want to go back 110 years throughout the entire history of the FBI, we see that same pattern, right? In the Hoover era, where they were much more blatant about police, speeching at police, they go after these same groups. And now they have this sort of very thinly rationalized evidence, right? Like Black identity extremism, the threat assessment has been widely criticized for, Black identity extremism is a movement the FBI made up whole cloth. But what it does is it treats speech about racism, speech about police brutality as being inherently suspicious. Another example would be an incident in California where there was a white supremacist protest. There were counter protesters. The white supremacists stab the counter protesters, and the FBI opens an investigation into the people who were stabbed. That shows blatant political bias, in my opinion. I think the evidence speaks for itself. And like I said, this is all open source material. If the FBI has, a larger sampling of data they want us to look at, they're welcome to declassify and release it.
How can this bias, this culture within the FBI be changed?
So that's a really good question. I mean, the bias seems deeply seated in the FBI. One of the things that I've found in my own archival research is again and again the FBI relying on right-wing sources of a dubious nature. Historically, their investigation into opponents of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, Committee in Solidarity to El Salvador, began based on something they read in the John Birch Society, investigation into a Black identity extremist started with something we saw on InfoWars. I wrote a very long investigation for the Intercept into the FBI's investigations into a nonviolent Palestinian solidarity group called International Solidarity Movement. And again, the predication for the investigation cites to these far-right sources of dubious veracity that contradict, reports on the State Department website, contradict reports from BBC, really far out there stuff. So it shows that they treat these sorts of things as legitimate. So how do you rein in the FBI? And I think it goes back to the question that was first posed in 1924, which is limiting the FBI's behavior to investigating violations of the criminal code. And, in our report, we have a whole bunch of recommendations for what Congress should do, right? The FBI to this day has no legislative charter, and Congress should be passing a legislative charter. It should include a requirement that all investigations have to have a factual predicate. Since 2008, and for the first time since the Church Committee, the FBI has created an entire category of investigations called assessments that don't require a factual predicate to believe the target of the investigation has engaged in criminal wrongdoing or threatens national security. And investigations involving the First Amendment need special protections. Specifically, the FBI should not be allowed to initiate or conduct any investigation that may involve the collection of information about the exercise of a U.S. person's First Amendment rights unless specific and articulable facts reasonably indicate the subject of the investigation has engaged in, is engaging, or is about to engage in a federal criminal offense. And before opening this investigation, they need to weigh the severity of the potential crime against the severity of the threat to civil liberties. I don't know if those things would get rid of the bias in the FBI, but they would make it more difficult for them to act on that bias.
Arguably, if the FBI started just outright working for the banks and for the pipelines or for these InfoWars type groups, it would be more honest and it would be doing pretty much similar things.
Yeah, I mean, the FBI does have political bias. I think it's also important to remember that this is impermissible political surveillance. It shouldn't be allowed. I know a lot of my friends who work for Muslim American civil society groups push back on the idea of having some of the programs that have been used to criminalize the Muslim American civil society to then go after white supremacists, saying we don't want equal opportunity surveillance. And right, at Defending Rights Dissent, we are opposed to any sort of surveillance of First Amendment activity that is not connected to, actual investigation of criminal wrongdoing. So it would not be better if they went out and did these types of lawless investigations to other groups. We oppose those because those are things we oppose, but it's just impossible to talk about them without noting the fact that the FBI continuously singles out particular types of groups, and that the FBI is particularly unable to distinguish between dissent and First Amendment protected speech and actual terrorism when certain points of view are involved, and that the FBI treats those points of view themselves as evidence of future terrorist activity. I mentioned before, I spent 5 years getting these documents from the FBI about their investigations into a nonviolent pro-Palestinian group. And in one of the documents where they're laying out the predication for the investigation, they flat out say the subjects have anti-globalization and anti-capitalist views, which coupled with their support for Palestinians could make them likely to be coerced in terrorism. That's a shocking statement. That is saying that, if you have these certain views that are freedom of speech, the FBI thinks you might go out and do this totally unrelated thing and will spy on you. So we don't want equal opportunity surveillance. We want serious checks on the FBI's ability to open these types of abusive investigations.
Could you please address the activities of the FBI abroad? What is it allowed to do?
That's a good question. I mean, the FBI does have legal attaché offices around the world. The FBI is tasked with violations of the federal criminal code. I don't quite know what the FBI does abroad. I do know in certain cases they have done overseas investigations. I believe those are in cooperation with host governments. But the FBI is our domestic intelligence agency. The CIA and the NSA, those are our foreign or international intelligence agencies.
And a brief history of FBI First Amendment abuses. There is this incident of Attorney General Biddle. Quote, Attorney General Biddle demands FBI destroy the list of people to be detained without trial in the event of national emergency.
Yeah, this is something I mentioned earlier in answer to your previous question. Hoover, he originally works at the Library of Congress. His system for spying on people uses index cards and is remarkably similar to the card catalog. Some historians claim he was influenced by it. Others dispute that. But when he headed the radical division, he made index cards and indexes of people who were then rounded up en masse during the Palmer raid. Something like 10,000 people were arrested. And if you think about the level of technology in 1919, finding 10,000 people is pretty impressive. When he returns to the intelligence game in the 30s, he starts creating indexes again. These indexes, as the historian Ellen Schrettner said very eloquently, are a tool for mass political surveillance, but their raison d'etre is that they're for detaining people in the event of a national emergency. Biddle says, he's the Attorney General then, he says, no, you can't do this. And Hoover just literally says, okay, I've gotten rid of the custodial detention list, but he just kept the list and changed the name. And later attorney generals who found out about this were totally cool with it, unfortunately.
Drawing from this example, can the FBI act autonomously? Can it maybe offer the government plausible deniability of this rogue agency, the deep state?
Yeah, I mean, that's always an interesting question, the extent to which the FBI is acting roguely or the extent to which it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. I mean, there are instances where Congress claims to be shocked about what the FBI is doing, and they seem genuinely shocked. The other reality is that, I mean, not all of this was a secret. There was an incident in, I believe, either the 40s or the 50s where there was a spy who was arrested and she was giving FBI documents to the Soviets, and the Department of Justice wanted to introduce these documents during the trial. And what they showed was that the FBI was engaged in political surveillance. So a group called the National Lawyers Guild called for an investigation into the FBI. They didn't get it. They did their own report on the FBI and basically found they were doing the same things the Church Committee would find, 20, 30 years later. And the FBI was spying on the National Lawyers Guild, including illegally breaking their office, including illegal wiretaps, including informants, and basically worked with the House Un-American Activities Committee to attack the Guild. And they sort of preempted the Guild's report by having HUAC issue its own report, which accused the National Lawyers Guild of being the legal bulwark of the Communist Party. They said they engaged in the Moscow Line, and the evidence of this was that they accused the FBI of engaging in all of these illegal acts that the FBI was in fact engaging in. Rather fascinating line of reasoning. So there are instances of the FBI going rogue. There are instances where I think Congress is genuinely surprised. The biggest problem, though, is just a lack of oversight. Like, Congress could be doing greater oversight of the FBI than it's doing, and it just isn't doing it. I would push for greater congressional oversight. I would push for a legislative charter. I would push for more transparency.
But the reputation of the FBI is arguably better than ever right now after years of Russiagate.
Yeah, I mean, amongst some people, amongst other people, it's quite low. I mean, traditionally, Republicans, conservative people have been more sympathetic to police. You hear Trump talk about law and order, intelligence agencies, and Trump has sort of spun this narrative about himself as being some sort of victim of the deep state, which I'm not really that sold on. And you have that, and as a result, approval for the FBI amongst Democrats is higher than it is amongst Republicans, and I think it's at an all-time high amongst liberals. And I wrote a piece for the Washington Post called "The Left is Warming Up to the FBI, That's a Mistake," talking about how the sort of concerns about Trump and the Russiagate stuff has led to liberals to embrace the FBI. And this is a huge error and mistake on their part, right? Like right now, Bill Barr is making a task force to go after so-called anti-fascists, to go after the George Floyd protesters. The FBI is still a tool of repression, and you shouldn't valorize them. On the one hand, Trump is complaining the deep state, Barr is complaining the deep state, but what have they done to actually check the FBI? Nothing. And on top of that, they are very clearly and openly using the FBI to go after the George Floyd protesters. They've put together an entire task force called the Task Force on Violent Anti-Government Extremists. I almost said violent government extremists. That's a different problem. And the task force is clearly gunning for these protesters, and it's based on this preventative model and this sort of, quote unquote, radicalization theory. So it opens the door to more political surveillance. So, no one on the left should champion the FBI. It's not their friend.
Some of the groups addressed in your work are the proponents of normalization with Cuba and Iran.
Yeah.
So the White House decides to improve relations with Cuba and Iran. Does it mean the FBI stops surveilling them, or does this go on automatically, or can the FBI just ignore the tone from the White House?
That's a really interesting question, and one I'm not sure of. I believe the attacks on normalization proponents of Cuba came after the Trump administration had reversed some of the Obama thing. But I would not put it past the FBI to continue to spy on proponents of normalization of Cuba while at the same time the Obama administration was pursuing that. Historically, I believe the FBI kept close ties to members of Congress who wanted to recognize the Soviet Union. After the Bolshevik Revolution, there's a period where we don't recognize the Soviet Union as the legitimate government in Russia, and there are people in Congress who say you have to. It is the government, and the FBI didn't like that.
And the George Floyd protesters will likely continue to be targeted, even if Biden comes to power and strikes a somewhat different tone.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were monitoring the Ferguson protesters under Obama. They were monitoring Occupy Wall Street under Obama. I mean, the FBI is going to do this. I do think the tone matters. I think that Trump and Barr and other people have really given license to the FBI to go after these people because they continuously use this bombastic rhetoric. They continuously talk about rioters. They continuously equate the protesters with terrorists. You have Donald Trump praising the fact that the U.S. Marshals shot and killed an Antifa member who was allegedly a suspect in a murder. He said today they didn't try to arrest him, and as a good thing. So, I mean, when you have a president and an attorney general who are using that type of rhetoric, it certainly gives license and gives a green light to ramp up repression. But this happened under the Obama administration. This happened under the Kennedy administration. This happened under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. This happened under Clinton. And there's no reason to believe this is not going to happen under the Biden administration unless there is some sort of groundswell of opposition to political surveillance, which I would like to see. I don't know how likely it is. We can hope.
what has your organizations and your personal experience with political surveillance, FBI surveillance been?
Sure. So the organization I work for, Defending Rights Dissent, it was founded in 2015 as a merger of two older groups, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the Defending Dissent Foundation. And the Defending Dissent Foundation actually traces its origins all the way back to a group that was founded in 1960 to oppose the House Un-American Activities Committee. The founder of that organization, Frank Wilkinson, had been spied on by the FBI throughout his life. Before he was a free speech activist, he was a public housing authority. The FBI gave his FBI file to developers who then brought up in court his left-wing political associations, which caused him to lose his job. The FBI continued to spy on him in our organization until a lawsuit in the 70s. The Church Committee actually mentions in one of its reports the spying on of our organization by the FBI, and there was a lawsuit about it that ended up with the release of something like 132,000 pages of files about Frank Wilkinson, the founder, and the group, which at the time was the largest FBI file ever known. So this is before I was born, so old history, but still very much in our minds, and part of the reason why we understand the threat that political surveillance plays in our democracy and how the FBI has served as a vehicle of political surveillance.
Have they tried to do to their critics now in recent times what they have done to the National Lawyers Guild?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. We've not seen, direct evidence of that at this point. But like I said, it's very hard to get any information about FBI surveillance. The Hoover era FBI was very notorious about going after people who criticized the Bureau and were very, very sensitive about it. I don't know if the current FBI is still quite as sensitive about that type of criticism or not.
Final question. You can confirm that everything completely changed under the ethical leadership of James Comey?
So James Comey is an interesting figure because one of the things he was running around talking about was the so-called Ferguson effect, which is very similar to the logic in the Black Identity Extremism report, which is this idea that there was an uptick in crime because people were protesting being murdered by the police. This is completely bunk. This is completely nonsense. And, that's who James Comey was. He presided over the FBI at a time when they were sending agent provocateurs into Muslim communities to make up fake terror plots. Some of those plots then turned out to be cited as rationale in Donald Trump's Muslim ban order, and Comey was running around talking about the non-existent Ferguson effect. So no, FBI was the FBI, whether it was Comey or Mueller in charge of it.
Thank you very much for this interview, Chip.
Well, thank you for having me on.